Hello, everyone. This is Margaret Smith, and I'm the Executive Director of the Trumpeter Swan Society. And I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Ohio Trumpeter Swans. Today's webinar is being recorded. You as a participant are muted and your video is turned off, but we do certainly welcome your questions. So during the presentation, you can put your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to those at the very end. And at the very end of the webinar, as you close out your browser, there's a very short survey, which is really important. I look at all of that, and so I would really appreciate it if you would fill that out. And then you will receive a link to the recording in 2 days once I upload it to YouTube. So you'll get an email from Zoom that'll have the link to the recording. Before we get started, there are a few people that I want to introduce that are also on our board that are kind of behind the scenes. They'll be helping us. There's Jim Hawkins from the Yukon, and Kelly Scouten from Kansas City Zoo, Lisa LaFranco from Pennsylvania, Marianne Coughlin, who will be asking the questions that you put in the Q&A box at the end, and Tiffany Mayo. Before I introduce Tiffany a little bit, I want to just briefly tell you what Trumpeter Swan Society does in case you're not sure of what we do. So some of you have sent me Trumpeter Watch reports, and Trumpeter Watch is our citizen science program where we have swan sightings. And today's speaker, Laura, is the person I send the Trumpeter Watch reports that come from Ohio. I send them to her so she knows about your sightings. We also do research. So we have a fund called the North American Swan Fund, which we can use for research and habitat projects. We also do education, such as this webinar, but we have other educational programs as well with our YouTube videos and our Instagram and education programs and resources for kids. We do advocacy and restoration and management. For the restoration, we work in Oregon to restore trumpeter swans to the state. And for the management, one of the things we're working on with other partners like Laura and others in the different flyways is the interior population management plan. Before we get started with Laura, I want to introduce Tiffany Mayo. So Tiffany's on our board. She's also the chair of the education committee. And Tiffany works with the zoos to get signets for restoration programs such as in Oregon. So Tiffany, want to just take a brief minute to talk about the role of zoos, which have played a really important part in restoration programs, even including Ohio.
Yeah, thank you, Margaret. So Margaret just wanted me to touch on the role of zoos in trumpeter swan restoration and conservation, because sometimes it's just not widely known how we have participated over the years. So for decades, we've helped participate in restoration programs all over the country and in Canada. We've provided signets, we've helped collect eggs. We have incubated those eggs at the zoos and helped raise them. And then we've helped release them. And so we have been heavily involved in a lot of the restoration programs since the 1980s and a little bit before then. And now we also do a lot of other things, pretty multifaceted. We provide funding for research. We've helped participate in research. And we've also helped create some really great educational opportunities. And what's really great about zoos is our outreach is, you know, here at the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo, it's 1 million visitors a year. So think about how many guests we can reach to teach them about trumpeter swans and wetland conservation. So really a holistic program that we help participate in, and we're very grateful that we've been able to be part of all this. And Laura will touch on how we've been involved in the Ohio programs.
Well, thank you, Tiffany. And I'll just introduce Laura. Laura is also on the Swan Technical Committee in the Mississippi Flyway. So I see her frequently at these meetings, and she comes to our conferences and makes presentations as well. And as I mentioned, Trumpeter Watch reports from Ohio are what I send to her, so she knows the swan sightings that are coming in through us. So take it away, Laura.
Great. Thanks so much for having me today. And I will Go ahead and advance my slides here. So yes, as Margaret said, I'll be talking about Ohio's trumpeter swans. So, yeah, today I'm going to touch on, first of all, a little bit about the history of trumpeter swans here in Ohio, including our reintroduction program. Then I'll talk about some of the management activities that we have done since reintroduction to ensure that we have a growing population. Then I'll go into a little bit more some of the population trends over the last 30 some years. And finally, I'll end with the movement research we did in conjunction with the University of Minnesota across the interior population of trumpeter swans. So this is a snapshot from eBird of the abundance of trumpeter swans across North America now. And I just wanted to point out we're in Ohio, so we're down here in sort of the southeast edge of the trumpeter swan range. So hopefully that gives you some perspective, geographic perspective. So yeah, just a little bit about the history of trumpeter swans in Ohio. So trumpeter swans are actually extirpated fairly early on from Ohio with European settlement. So during the time when the French were trapping furs and kind of in the area. And then we know that overall, the trumpeter swan population continued to decline across U.S. particularly, and by the 1930s, there were fewer than 100 trumpeter swans in the lower 48 states. But after that time period, there started to be other reintroductions throughout the Midwest, particularly. And so in the mid-1990s, Ohio decided to do a reintroduction. And then that lasted from 1996 to 2003. I'm going to go into that more here in a moment. But basically from 2003 on, we have witnessed ongoing population growth, which I'll talk about later in more detail. And this has led actually to, in 2024, just last year, we were finally able to delist trumpeter swans from our state threatened and endangered species list. So it's really been an amazing recovery. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the Ohio reintroduction now. And before I get into the details of the actual reintroduction, I'm going to talk about just some important things that need to happen before a state decides to do a reintroduction, and specifically with migratory birds, because they're special for reasons I'll explain here in a moment. But basically, the first step that needed to happen was for the state agency to have buy-in. And here in Ohio, Gito Torrey was the waterfowl biologist at the time and the project lead on this. And one of the things that they needed to do was confirm evidence of trumpeter swans breeding in Ohio. And that was kind of a challenge because, like I said, they had been extirpated fairly early on during the times of European settlement. And so we didn't have a lot of recorded, there wasn't a lot of records, but they were able to comb through with partners from other locations, able to comb through some of the records from the French settling in the area during those times and find evidence of these swans breeding in the Detroit River area, which is just a little bit north of Ohio, but then throughout the wetlands that extended down into what's Northwest Ohio now. So they were able to do that. And then from that point on, they developed a plan. They wanted to have a good plan in place. So once those background steps were taken at the state level, then it was important to get approvals. So trumpeter swans are migratory birds, and so they are protected and regulated under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is a federal law. So So this required approvals from multiple flyway councils. And the flyway councils are there's 4 administrative flyway councils throughout the US. Ohio is within the Mississippi Flyway, so we needed approval from the Mississippi Flyway, as well as the Pacific Flyway, because we, in our reintroduction plan, we were going to go to Alaska, and there was an abundant trumpeter swan population in Alaska, so we were going to take eggs from the nest of the Alaskan birds and then bring those back and hatch them out and release those young as part of our reintroduction efforts. So we needed the Pacific Flyway, and then also, of course, the cooperation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, who oversees regulation of the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. So here is just kind of a statement of purpose that we had about the trumpeter swan reintroduction. So again, required that approval from the Mississippi Flyway Council. The request for 50 eggs was approved by the Pacific Flyway Council. And then we were working together with Fish and Wildlife Service. So they also helped assist in the actual collection of the eggs up in Alaska. So anyway, there's basically, you had to have a lot of collaboration between the Fish and Wildlife Service, our state agency, and then a number of private partners, like Tiffany talked about the zoos. They were instrumental in helping with all this as well, and other individuals. Okay, so the reintroduction itself, like I said earlier, it actually occurred from 1996 to 2003. So that was the period when we were actively putting trumpeter swans from into the wild. So we're basically 2 ways that was done. So I talked about the second bullet here, swans captive reared from eggs from the Alaskan population. So that was one method. And basically 50 eggs were retrieved from Alaskan nests from 1996 through 1998. So they went up there for 3 years, retrieved those eggs, brought them back in incubators, and hatched those out. And this is where the zoos helped with raising those young to get them ready for release. But then there were also some adult trumpeter swans that had come from captive populations of trumpeter swans. A lot of these were in zoos and other locations, but then some, there actually are private breeders of trumpeter swans. And so we actually paid for taking those individuals and releasing them into the wild. So the initial reintroduction was these adult trumpeter swans raised in captivity that first year, and then it was supplemented with those captive reared from the Alaskan nests, from the Alaskan eggs, and then additional captive trumpeter swans up through 2003. So, okay, and then there were several locations throughout the state. They didn't want to have all your swans located in one location, because if you have everything, if you have all your eggs in one basket, then that makes the population more susceptible. So they spread out the reintroductions at multiple areas across the state. Most of these areas were public wildlife areas, state-owned wildlife areas. One exception here was, I'm going to turn on my laser pointer. So Cedar Point National Wildlife Refuge, it's a federal wildlife refuge. And then Winus Point here, this is Winus Point Shooting Club, Marsh Conservancy, the oldest duck hunting club in the US, but they do a lot of wetland protection, restoration, and had really great habitat for release of the trumpeter swans. Another duck club called the Toussaint Shooting Club had some great wetland habitat. They wanted to support this effort. And then the wilds, Tiffany was talking about the zoos. The wilds is also a conservation facility for endangered species. They do a lot of captive breeding of endangered wildlife, but they also have a lot of habitat that was actually suitable for swans as well. So there were some releases done there as well. Okay. So here were some of the initial statistics from the reintroduction period. And basically the goal for the reintroduction was to have 15 breeding pairs before they would stop releasing swans. So again, it took about 7 years to get to that point. So the blue here represents the number of breeding pairs. So kind of a slow start there at the beginning, but gradually we got up to the number of pairs that were needed in the plan. And you can see that, the first couple of years cygnet production wasn't very good, but then it just was continuing to increase during that time. So that was the initial stance. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the management that had to take place to get our trumpeter swan then growing after that reintroduction period. And the first thing I want to draw your attention to is our wetland habitat here in Ohio. And unfortunately, Ohio has the distinction of being one of the states in the US with the greatest amount of wetland habitat loss. So between the 1780s, we had almost 5 million acres of wetland habitat. And then in the 1990s, we were down to just a fraction of that. We had greater than 90% loss of our wetlands, so only around 500,000 acres by the 1990s. So that's a huge issue. Trumpeter swans being a wetland dependent species, that definitely is a thing that we needed to take into consideration with this trumpeter swan reintroduction. So indeed, wetland management and restoration has been really key to helping to boost our trumpeter swan population. So since the 1990s, initially more than 3,500 acres had been restored of wetland habitat had been restored on just private land. Over 1,000 acres had been restored or added to public state land. And then just recently, like in the past several years, we now have in the state of Ohio an H2Ohio program. And that has been focused on restoring wetland habitat. And since that program was initiated in 2019, we've restored an additional 19,000 acres of wetland habitat. Ducks Unlimited is another great organization helping us with wetland restoration. So all of this work has been a huge benefit to our swan population as well. The second kind of management piece that I want to talk about is control of invasive species. So one of the issues in wetland habitat management are the invasive plant species. So one of the big species that we control is Phragmites. It's common reed. It was introduced from Europe, Eurasia, and it can take over a wetland pretty quickly, and it just reduces the sort of the quality of the wetland. So flowering rush is another invasive. So these are vegetative invasives that we try to control. We spent over $100,000, probably twice that, really, in terms of trying to control these. Purple loosestrife was is another invasive plant species that tends to take over entire wetlands. And actually, there's a beetle that will eat the purple loosestrife, and that was introduced and has been fairly effective in helping to control purple loosestrife in our wetlands. So finally, the last invasive that we've had to deal with are muteswans. So the picture here on the right shows the muteswan. Muteswans have orange bills versus a trumpeter swan, which has the black bill. So I'm going to talk a little more about muteswan control here now. And again, just want to point out that we actually have, it's not just two species of swan in Ohio. We have the trumpeter swan and the mute swan, but we also have the tundra swan. But I want to note that the tundra swan is a migrant or a wintering species here in the state. So they don't compete for breeding habitat. But part of the issue with the mute swans is that they're competing for breeding habitat with the trumpeter swan. So just a little bit of the history of mute swans. So in North America, they were introduced around the mid 19th century. So people just, people like swans. They wanted to have, swans on their ponds and things like that. And, again, our trumpeter swan population had been greatly reduced. And so they started to introduce these mute swans. But the idea was that they were going to be captive. They weren't going to be wild. In Ohio, our first mute swan wasn't introduced until the early 1900s, 1911, introduced in Akron, Ohio. This is in Northeast Ohio. And so we had some mute swans introduced, but again, held captively, so to speak. And then, of course, over time, some of them escaped, became feral. And so we actually first documented breeding of feral populations of mute swans in 1987. So this was documented in western Lake Erie, up in Northwest Ohio. And then since that date, there was kind of continued growth of the mute swan population here in the state. So we're going to look here at some data. This is from the Christmas bird count. So actually, this is from 1990 to 2013. So the black here are the mute swan populations, and this is just an index of population. It's not actual numbers, but this is the number of number of swans counted by party hour on the Christmas count. So relative abundance here, just showing trends. But you can see in the early 1990s, we had mute swans on the landscape. This was before the trumpeter swan population. Mid 1990s, the trumpeter swan reintroduction started. We started to see that climb in the trumpeter swans. Meanwhile, the mute swan population continued to grow. But then here in the mid 2000s, we started to see some maybe competition going on and between the trumpeter swans and the mute swans. So they have similar breeding requirements, used similar types of wetland areas for breeding. So we were starting to see some competition from the mute swans. So it was determined that the mute swans were becoming an issue for the success of our trumpeter swan population. So we developed some plans for how to do this. What was a way that we could help control mute swans? So we developed an Ohio Swan Management Plan. And we had some goals that we wanted to achieve by the year 2020. And the first of those was to, reduce the mute swan on our public lands to 0. So this is just on state wildlife areas and then other, like the National Wildlife Refuges, Metro Park properties, things like that. But we wanted to reduce the mute swan population on our public lands to 0. And again, that's where most of our trumpeter swans were at this point. So that made sense. And then we wanted to try to reduce mute swan population growth in the rest of the state to 0. We knew that it probably wasn't practical to completely eliminate the mute swan population, but if at least we could control growth, then that would help keep mute swan population levels low. And then in that plan, we also had goals for the trumpeter swan population. We wanted to increase the trumpeter swan breeding population to 15 counties. So we wanted to make sure we had a spread or a expansion of the swan population throughout the state. And we have, by the way, we have 88 counties in Ohio. So 15 is a relatively small number, but given that we really only reintroduced in 5 or 6 counties, this kind of just ensured that the population was growing and expanding. And then in terms of the breeding pair goal, we wanted to get up to a number 40 breeding pairs for 3 consecutive years. And just remember, for stopping the reintroduction or being like satisfied with their reintroduction, that goal was just 15. So this is more than a doubling of what those reintroduction goals were, but at least get up to 40 pairs and to have that at a consistent level over time. So some other key things that we needed to implement this. So muteswans were actually protected under the Federal Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but a Migratory Bird Treaty Reform Act was passed in 2004, and that removed federal protections from non-native birds. At this time, it was becoming apparent in the wildlife community that non-native bird species were causing issues for native birds. It wasn't just muteswans, but other things like house sparrows and European starlings and things like that. So those were also included. But important changes in the Ohio policy had to occur as well for us to be able to control muteswans. So we had a muteswan action plan established in the administrative code. And then in the division, we had a policy 41, which granted us, meaning the Division of Wildlife State Agency, authorization to humanely dispatch invasive species found on division-owned public lands. And so we implemented the Ohio Swan Management Plan. So again, just to review some dates here, again, black is the muteswan population, blue is the trumpeter swan population. Again, that period with the trumpeter swan reintroduction. We did a little bit of doing a little bit of muteswan control in the early, the mid 2000s, but then we really kind of pushed the muteswan control a little more with this Ohio Swan Management Plan in 2013. So between 2006, 2013 was when we were kind of seeing that kind of back and forth going on between the muteswan population and the trumpeter swan population. But you can see that we started that Ohio Swan Management Plan, ramped up our efforts with muteswan control, and this has led to decrease in the muteswan population and then just kind of some stabilization over time at relatively low levels here in the state. But during that same time, we've just really seen our trumpeter swan population take off, and it's just been doing really well. So, yeah, basically now we have a fairly well-controlled population of muteswans here in the state of Ohio. And I just wanted to show, we've got a couple of maps here showing current muteswan distribution. So these are from eBird, and basically the first map here in the top, this is showing muteswan abundance distribution from 2009 to 2023. And then the map here is just showing the muteswan abundance. This is more of a live capture from eBird for 2025. And the darker the yellow color, or the orange or red, is the higher the densities. And so I just want to point out that here in Ohio, yes, we still have muteswans in the state, but they are at this relatively low level of 0 to 2%, compared to places like Michigan and Ontario, which still have some areas with some higher densities of muteswans. But generally speaking, we're keeping the muteswan population under control here in Ohio. So now I'm going to shift and talk about a little bit more about the trumpeter swan breeding population status. So earlier I just showed this portion right here between 1996 to 2003. So the blue is the number of breeding pairs, the red is the number of cygnets. And so you can just see over time how our population has increased. And so just this, and this, I just want to say that this, these data come from a survey that we conduct every July by helicopter. We fly over, again, our primary wetland areas here in the state, and we count breeding pairs, the number of cygnets that they have with them, and then any other additional non-breeding swans. So just this past July, when we did the survey, we counted 374 cygnets, which is a record high, 187 pairs, which is also a record high. And then I don't show this on the graph, but we had 331 non-breeding adults, or at least they weren't in breeding pairs. They could have been breeders that failed and they just were congregating with other small flocks. And this gave us a total of over 1,000 swans in our state. So just really incredible if you think 30 years ago, there were no trumpeter swans here in the state of Ohio. So really, the trumpeter swan has been a success story. I just want to highlight again some key points there. 2003, our reintroduction in, I should actually read 15, not 13, but we had 15 pairs there. In 2012, we downgraded our trumpeter swans from endangered to threatened. And then again, we saw continued growth after that period again, after enacting that mute swan control, after also doing a lot more wetland restoration. And it's just been amazing to continue to see our population climb at the rates that it has. Oh, and then the state delisting, at that time we had 153 pairs in the 2024 survey. So even between 24 and 25, 153 pairs, 187 pairs. We've just seen really tremendous growth. So yeah, and here's the expansion of the trumpeter swan throughout Ohio. Again, remember that map I showed kind of outlining some of those reintroduction areas. So the yellow hash marked areas, those are the counties where we did the original reintroductions. And so all the ones that are just shaded without the hash marks in gray are counties where trumpeter swans have expanded over the last 30 years. So we now have breeding pairs in 31 counties here in the state of Ohio. So originally there were only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 counties of reintroduction. So have tripled, more than tripled, almost quadrupled, I think, if I'm doing math in my head, since the reintroduction period. So again, really good recovery here in the state of Ohio. So I know some of you might be curious, how does Ohio's population compare to other states within the interior population? And I didn't have any data for this year, but I was able to get some data from 2022. So Ohio is still a relatively, we're over here in 4th place, has a relatively small amount of the interior populations, trumpeter swan population. Minnesota and Wisconsin have, boom, the bulk of the population. And then there's these smaller populations in Nebraska, here in Ohio, Michigan, and Iowa. So yeah, we don't have quite as large amount of the population as these other states, but it's great to have the population spread across these states, just in case of like huge disease outbreaks or something like that, that helps to protect the population to have that geographic spread. Okay, so now I'm going to end with a discussion about some of the movement that we saw during the interior population trumpeter swan migration ecology study. And again, this was led through the University of Minnesota. David Wolfson was the graduate student who was the lead on the project, did a really fantastic job with it. Here in Ohio, we had a couple questions we wanted to specifically gain from participating in this project. Is one, we had some questions about, we'd done some early work during the early years, right after the reintroduction, when a lot of the birds were still collared. We were able to track the swans and see a little bit of migration, but we hadn't done any research for about 20 years. And so we didn't really know what now that our populations are bigger, what are Ohio swans doing during migration, during winter migration specifically? Do they migrate? And if so, where do they go? And then secondly, we're just curious, how are Ohio swans using the landscape? So we deployed these collars, these net collars, and they had a solar battery on them. That's what the little black window is there. And they were able to send GPS signals through the cellular network. That's what the GSM stands for. So a really very handy way to track swans. And what's important to be aware of is that this post-breeding molt period of the swan's annual cycle is really important for understanding or for being able to capture swans, because during this time period, the swans can't fly. So this is a photo of a swan that's going through this molt period, and they lose their flight feathers on their wings. And you can see the blood feathers coming in. That's the new feather growth. But during this time, like the feathers haven't emerged completely, so the birds can't fly. So they're grounded for a period of a few weeks. And so this is the time when you can most easily capture swans. So that's when the birds were captured to deploy these collars. So we deployed 20 of these collars throughout Ohio, and we tried to spread them out across the major breeding areas or major areas of breeding trumpeter swans here in the state. So we deployed 8 in northwest Ohio, 6 in northeast Ohio, and then 6 in central Ohio. And this is what we found. We found that our swans really didn't move a whole lot. They like to stay pretty close to home. So the average, what we call displacement or movement by location. So those northwest birds. So I just want to mention, these are, again, we had relatively small sample size. These are not statistically significant, but it is interesting that there is a little bit of a trend here in that these northwest birds, they moved the least amount. So only 10 miles on average. Northeast Ohio moved just a little bit more, about 15 miles on average. And then the north central Ohio birds moved a little bit further, between 20 and 25 miles on average. So yeah, just kind of interesting to see some of those differences. And then we also looked at that displacement by season. So the breeding season, we had the least amount of movement, which makes sense because the birds are probably, on nests, or they're with their cygnets and, just keeping a smaller home range. In the fall, we get a little more movement, about 29 miles. And then in winter is when we see the most movement. Presumably they're moving because of colder weather and things like that, but still only an average movement of about 39 miles. So again, relatively small movements. And so, again, basically the most movement we saw were these north central Ohio birds and during the winter. And so this is kind of just a composite of some of those movements. So just point out here, this group up here, these were birds at Killdeer Plains Wildlife Area, which is a wetland, grassland, primarily wetland grassland habitat complex up here. And then right here, this is Big Island Wildlife Area, kind of very similar habitat to Killdeer Plains, but that's important concentrations, breeding areas for trumpeter swans in this area. And so what was interesting was we found that during periods of when the temperatures got below freezing and the wetlands froze up, a lot of these birds were going down to this area just north of Columbus, Ohio, central Ohio. And it's just fascinating to see they all went to this one quarry just north of Columbus. And that quarry has deeper water, it stays open for longer. And then there's actually some pretty good proximity to some agricultural fields nearby. So during the day, the birds could go out and feed in the fields and then go to roost in the quarry waters at night. And then I'll end with just mentioning some of the some unusual or interesting dispersal behaviors. So these were not migrations. These did not happen during the winter period, but these were basically in the spring or at other times of the year. So so one of the things we were interested is, how much of our swans are going into other states and that sort of thing. And so one of our birds, this was one of the Northeast Ohio birds that was captured, did disperse into Pennsylvania eventually. And in Pennsylvania, they haven't done any kind of reintroduction for swans or anything like that, but we could see that our bird was, it was kind of exploring. This was captured as a non-breeder. It explored. It went into Western Ohio and explored a little bit. I think this location was actually over at that Killdeer Plains wildlife area that I talked about. But then they went up into Northwest Pennsylvania and spent quite a bit of time there in the late summer, early fall of 2022. Now, unfortunately, this bird was confirmed deceased in October of 22. Just a member of the public found the bird, retrieved the collar, and so unfortunately we didn't get the notification about it soon enough to retrieve the bird and actually look at it to determine what happened to it. But again, it was interesting to see again these dispersal movements, kind of these forays somewhere else into Western Ohio and then over into Northeast Pennsylvania. But the two that were probably the most interesting were these two. So 6M was captured in Northeast Ohio right here, and it was a female, a non-breeder. In the spring after her capture, she actually did a long distance dispersal all the way up here into eastern Manitoba, Canada, and spent the summer there. Like she fell off the radar. We thought, something happened with the collar or she died. But then in the fall, so out there in Manitoba, there aren't that many cell phone towers, so we weren't able to get the data. But then she came back that fall, and the collars started uploading through the cellular network, and we were able to get data. And it was just amazing that she went up there, spent the summer, and then came back for winter down here. She didn't quite go back over to Northeast Ohio. She hung out here in Northwest Ohio. But that was pretty interesting. And then 9N, this was one of the birds we captured in Central Ohio as a breeder, actually. So she had some cygnets when we captured her. And she also in the spring of 2022 just took off. And all the way up in, again, it's kind of similar areas, 6M, but there in Western Ontario. And then she came back that winter into Central Ohio. And again, she had gone off the radar. We didn't know where she was. And then in the fall, we started getting her data uploaded and boom. So she was back. So they returned around November of 2022. So 6M, we lost signal on her in kind of the following spring in 2023. I don't think we've had any resightings of her or anything since then. But 9N is actually, the caller is still active on 9N, and we get lots of reports from her, from our staff who work at, she's at Delaware Wildlife Area, just north of the Columbus area. And so, yeah, here's actually a photo. I believe this was from 2023, but she successfully reproducing and has the last few years. So yeah, just really neat that this bird made this incredible journey and has come back and continued to breed here in Ohio. And she hasn't taken that long dispersal since. So it could be that her nest failed or something that spring of 2022, and she just decided to take a break, go on a little vacation. But then again, she's had successful breeding since then. So I just want to wrap up by saying that some of this movement study has now been published. So David Wolfson published on part of his dissertation and results of the interior population migration study that's been published just this past year in the journal Ornithology, which you can go online and look at it for free. And then also David co-authored a publication with me that's focused on just the Ohio movements, but we've also discussed kind of the whole history of the reintroduction and the and also the mute swan management that we did to help with the trumpeter swan success. So I just want to thank all of the partners who've helped not only with the reintroduction, but also the staff who helped with the movement ecology study. So yeah, lots of staff. A lot of these were staff who helped with the movement study. Fish and Wildlife Service has been instrumental throughout both the reintroduction and the movement study. Ducks Unlimited for their support in supporting wetland restoration here in the state of Ohio. Winus Point, I mentioned before, as being important during that reintroduction, but also they helped with the movement ecology study. Again, Cleveland Metro Park Zoo, that's where Tiffany works, the Toledo Zoo, the Cincinnati Zoo, Medina County Park District, all these were instrumental in helping with the movement study, either providing funds or access to the properties or having staff come out and join us. Here are some of the different individuals. And then there were also chapters in many of the I forget what AAZK stands for off the top of my head, but these are the zoo employees of the zoo chapters. They were really helpful in helping to fund some of the movement studies. So I apologize if I have missed anyone out, but just again, thanks to the many partners who have supported the trumpeter swan recovery here in the state of Ohio. It takes a village to do something like this. Lots of folks and people working hard. So here's my email. I think we have some time for questions now. So I will let Margaret take it from here.
Great. Well, thank you, Laura. I learned a lot and it was really interesting, and love those maps of those swans going to that one quarry. I thought that was really fun.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Marianne, are there any questions that have come in?
Hi, Margaret and Laura. Yes, we do have several questions. The first one is, did you experience a lot of public resistance to the mute swan control program, and how did you effectively counter that?
Yes. Yeah, that definitely was difficult for some segments of the public. So we did some different things. One is we had some educational programming. We had a pamphlet, or a couple of different flyers and pamphlets that kind of explained why there were issues with mute swans. And it wasn't just the trumpeter swans, but they also compete with native wildlife. They consume a lot of the vegetation and kind of disrupt some of the native wetland habitat. And then also the mute swans, they tend to be more aggressive here towards trumpeter swans. There were actually some instances of people being harassed, or in one drastic case, somebody was actually killed by a mute swan. There's a little bit of a story there. But we had all these educational materials about why mute swans were a problem for our natural resources. So educational campaign, we got letters of support from a lot of our other partners and organizations that, kind of gave the division additional support that, yes, this is an important thing that needs to be done. And so, yeah, so we went on kind of an educational campaign about why we're doing this, and kind of, that was the big thing. Trying to think. Yeah, that I'll just end with that for now. Yeah.
Thank you. This question is about trumpeter swans. Have you had any problems with people shooting trumpeter swans, or deaths from lead poisoning or hitting power lines?
Yes. Yeah. Just the Trumpeter Swan Society talks about all those things as still being issues for trumpeter swans. And yes, we have instances of all those things happening with swans here in Ohio. Fortunately, it hasn't offset the growth thus far, but yeah, things that we try to remedy where we can. Yes, unfortunately, people accidentally, maybe accidentally, maybe on purpose, but they do get accidentally shot during like waterfowl hunting seasons. With the power line collisions, yes, we try to note when there are maybe areas that where we see repeated power lines, and then work with the utility companies to put in the diverters or visual apparatuses to help make the power lines more apparent. The lead poisoning, yeah, continued to work towards minimizing lead use in fishing and waterfowl hunting. So yes, there's still issues that we're constantly working on and need to be aware of and vigilant of.
So this is a question I'm not actually sure if you'll have an answer to, but it's someone who photographed a trumpeter swan back in 2006, and they did have a tag. The number was 960, and they've tried to look them up on eBird, and that sighting is considered provisional, possibly an escape. So the question is, since they had seen the bird there for some time, is there a way that they can check or confirm that particular bird sighting?
That would be a great thing if they haven't reported to the Trumpeter Watch. That would be helpful, and then those get forwarded. I assume this was in Ohio. But yeah, if they can report it to Trumpeter Watch, that'll get forwarded to me, and then I can look into it a little bit more. Off the top of my head, I know there were a lot of birds collared during the reintroduction phase, and then shortly thereafter, and then we didn't collar for a while. So I'd have to look back through our records, but maybe we can get down to the bottom of it that way.
Laura, it's Jim Hawkins here in Whitehorse. I'm looking at the question. I think that was one of the yellow wing tags, probably from Ontario, I'm guessing, but it was a wing tag.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Well, this is Margaret. The best thing to do if you see a bird like that is to go to our website, and on the homepage you can go to Report a Swan and just fill out the form and send that Trumpeter Watch. So if there is an Ontario bird in Ohio, Laura will get that notice, that trumpeter watch report, as will Gary Lane up in Ontario, so that both parties know that an Ontario swan, would be in Ohio. So that'd be
Yeah.
the best thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and we have gotten other reports of Ontario swans in Ohio over the years, so that wouldn't surprise me at all.
So the next question is about beavers. Does the presence of beavers help restore habitat for trumpeter swans? And so this person is near a Killebuk Lakes in Medina County that now has a beaver population. So they're interested in whether it helps the swans, which didn't seem to stay there for very long, or if does that have an impact on the trumpeter swans?
That's a great question. It's not something that we have researched specifically, so I really can't speak from like any research that we've done. I don't know, Margaret, if you are aware of any work looking at the interactions between beavers and trumpeter swans.
I don't have anything offhand. We might have something in the archives, but that might be something that I might ask Ken Abrahams up in Ontario as well, who has access to a lot of information. And there might be something in the western part of the United States because they've done more work out there in the west with beavers than in Ohio, is my understanding. We can check on it.
And then our last question is actually about breeding. And this is from someone who cited a source saying that trumpeter swans did not breed in Ohio, according to historical records. And they're wondering if that theory is still supported, or it does seem now that we are seeing trumpeter swans currently breeding in Ohio. Is that something, was there ever a point that they were not breeding in Ohio?
Right. So that's what I talked about in the beginning of the presentation when we decided to do the reintroduction. We looked into that specifically because we didn't want to just reintroduce swans somewhere that they hadn't been before. And again, with Ohio, because they had been gone for so long, like I said, we had to search through, do some pretty extensive literature searches, and it needed to go back fairly long ago. So there were several different individuals who helped do some of that research. They combed through some of the documents from the French who were in the area during those times in like the 1600s, early 1700s, and that's where they found evidence of swans, trumpeter swan, and it had to be trumpeter swans because the tundraswans would breed way far north, but the trumpeter swans were breeding in the Detroit River area, which is just north of Ohio. And then also they mentioned in the wetlands. So the wetlands extended all the way down along the western shore of Lake Erie into Ohio. We had the Great Black Swamp area in the Toledo area, and then they continued on to like Sandusky area. So from those documents during those French settlement times, we had evidence that trumpeter swans were breeding here at one point in time. So again, we wouldn't have done that reintroduction if we didn't have that evidence about the swans being here.
Thank you. We did get a lot of comments that people thanking you for a wonderful presentation, Laura. And with that, I'll turn it over to Margaret.
Great. Well, thank you, Marianne. And thank you, Laura, for your fabulous presentation, and to our panelists here. Just wanted to remind everyone to, as you close your browser, there's going to be a brief survey, which I hope you will fill out. I want to know what your understanding was of the Ohio Swan story before and after the webinar, and any comments or anything that you found particularly interesting. I think that would be wonderful. And then I will be uploading the recording to YouTube. And as I had mentioned earlier, you will be receiving a link to that recording on YouTube in 2 days. So with that, thank you all so much for coming. I really appreciate that, and hopefully we'll see you again next time. Thank you.